Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you. Thanks for coming. I'm Representative Kristen Robbins. I'm from 37A, and I'm also the chair of the House Fraud and State Agency Oversight Committee. Yesterday, we had our last committee meeting of the session, so we just kind of wanted to get everyone together and talk about the success the committee had this year and why it's really important for the committee to continue and become part of the institution of the legislature. So as I've said many times, fraud is not a partisan issue. It's a separation of powers issue. And I think that has been very fruitful for us this session. We've had some good bipartisan work on the joint letter that we sent asking for committees not to do legislatively named grants or earmarks this year. And not only did all of the members of our committee sign that letter, but then the co-chairs of Ways and Means, Chair Torkelson and Chair Stevenson, also sent their own letter. And I think we have seen really significant reductions in earmarks in the different bills that I've seen coming through Ways and Means. So I think that's a big win and good for the culture. It's kind of a reset here at the legislature on that. The other thing I think that we've had great success with, so the three buckets of the committee have been to expose fraud. Sunlight is a really good disinfectant, not only to make legislators more aware of it, but make the public more aware of it. And then secondly, it's to find gaps in statute or tools that agencies need to better manage grants or better manage the programs that they're running. And that came through many weeks of testimony. We heard from all the different agencies, as well as from the Office of Legislative Auditor and the Office of Grants Management. And through those hearings, we were honestly stunned sometimes to hear that they even though they have the ability to stop payments when there's credible allegation of fraud, they weren't necessarily doing it. They requested help on getting a state kickback statute. They also recommended that we ensure that everyone with grants management responsibilities is required to take the training that OGM offers. So we put together two bills on that. That came late in the session because we heard all the testimony, and then we put together our committee bills. So those we heard informationally yesterday, but a lot of the pieces of that are moving in other bills, and we hope to get that across the finish line. And then the third bucket of what the mission of the committee was is just to be a place where the public learns about it and can help us by identifying fraud. So we created the mnfraud.com portal where people can whistleblow, and we also are working on a bill to strengthen whistleblower protections that I hope makes it over the finish line this year. And in the first week of mnfraud.com, we had 530 submissions that honestly I haven't even had time to go through. That's one of our big projects in the interim, is to get through all those submissions. But we continue as a committee to continue to meet with whistleblowers. We've got another meeting this afternoon, in fact. So the work is going to continue, but I think in those three buckets we've had great success. And I just want to remind everyone that the mission of the committee is really to make sure that taxpayers' hard-earned money is going to the needy, not the greedy. And we cannot lose sight of the fact that vulnerable Minnesotans, this is the business model of fraud we identified, vulnerable Minnesotans are being taken advantage of so people can build a business by defrauding taxpayers that then they use for personal gain. And that is abhorrent to everyone in state government. That is abhorrent to the providers who see it and whistleblow to us. And we want to make sure that needy citizens, vulnerable citizens are not taken advantage of, and that taxpayers' money goes to where it is needed. So that's just a little overview of our work this session. It's been terrific. We are continuing to work to get pieces of different fraud reform bills over the finish line. And with that, I'll turn it over to my Vice Chair, Patty Anderson, and she'll say a few words.
Thank you, Chair Robbins. I'm Patty Anderson, Delwood, District 33A. Over the last year, and even before the session started, it's become really apparent that we need to do more in regards to oversight within state agencies. And it's not just the agency staff, we're talking about all the vendors, and I call vendors, whether they're nonprofit, whether they're for-profit companies, but they're people that provide or are supposedly providing services to our citizens, and we're paying them with tax dollars. But it's become obvious that the structure that existed, where you have some OIGs, Office of Inspector Generals, small ones within these departments, hasn't worked. It hasn't caught the fraud. When they do see it, they haven't done enough. They've sent stuff to BCA. I can tell you there were just very few cases that the BCA took, that DHS sent over the last couple of years. And so fraud's been allowed to just get larger and larger and larger. Starting at the beginning of the session, there's been a bipartisan group, as you're aware, that's been working on an Office of Inspector General statewide bill. That bill, I think you're going to see. We're going to get this passed. The Senate, we've been working with Senator Gustafson, Senator Cruin, and others over in the Senate and here in the House. It's been a bipartisan group, which includes Representative Cleavorn and Norris on the Democrat side. The House bill right now has been kind of sitting in State Gov. It's sitting there until we finish the final negotiations. The Senate bill has been the bill that's been moving, and that's going to be on the floor, I think, tomorrow or Thursday. It's going through Finance. It's close. It's not perfect. It's not what we will probably pass out of the House, but we're close enough with a lot of the language that I think in the end we're going to have a bill. We're going to set up a statewide Office of Inspector General that has full investigatory authority, that has full, essentially what we call police powers. And that's really, really important for the future of the state of Minnesota. So that's what I'll be spending the last 2 weeks of session trying to get done and get accomplished for the citizens of Minnesota. You probably saw the governor said that if we can get that done, he'll sign it. That's good news. And so we're going to get that done. I want to turn this over to another member of the Fraud Committee, Representative Walter Hudson, who's going to say a few words. Thanks.
Good morning. My name is Representative Walter Hudson. I represent District 30A. That's the St. Michael and Albertville area and surrounding communities. So I want to share kind of my collective experience over these many weeks of these different hearings that we've had, where we've had state agencies come in and explain their process of how they manage grants. And it's been a fascinating experience because it's tough to sift through the sand of their presentation, which of course is going to be presented in a light that makes them look well. You would expect them to do that, to sift through that and to try to find where the indications of problems are. And one of the overriding themes that I've noticed is that there seems to be a focus on bureaucratic process for the sake of maintaining the appearance of compliance with expectations, rather than ensuring that the actual intent of that bureaucratic process is manifest in the real world. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to get grant recipients, these folks who we've entrusted with public dollars to provide services to Minnesotans, to actually be on the up and up, to run their operations in a competent manner, in a professional manner, with integrity, where they're actually delivering the services. The impact of the grant management from the state agencies should be to affect that, but it hasn't been. And I'll give you a specific example. This one really stood out to me. So we had a hearing where we got bogged down in talking about conflict of interest, the concept of conflict of interest. And it became very clear in the way that the agency was talking about that their focus was on obtaining a sheet of paper from the grant recipient that says there's no conflict of interest. So one of the OLA findings was that this sheet of paper is not being collected properly by the state agencies. But the sheet of paper is just an attestation that there's no conflict of interest. There's no process that actually determines whether or not there's one. And so the focus is on, let's get the sheet of paper that tells us there's no problem, make sure it gets put in the right file, and all is well with the world. And obviously we know that's not how things work. The other thing that's very evident from the hearings that we had, particularly towards the end here of the session, is that there is, intentionally or not, a culture of fraud that has been fostered by the current administration. And that became very clear when we addressed Attorney General Keith Ellison and had him come in to testify regarding the disclosed audio that has now been heard by virtually everyone at this point, where he's in a conversation with folks who would later be indicted in the Feeding Our Future scandal. And there's been a lot of interesting tap dancing around that about, campaign contributions and where did this take place and who was he talking to and when. But all of that is kind of beside the point. The point of that revelation is in the content of what the Attorney General said. What he said was, we are in a battle with state agencies. He said, we are going to fight these people in reference to the state agencies. The state agencies are his client. If you hired a lawyer and somebody sued you, and your lawyer met with them without you and trash talked you and talked about how he was fighting you, his client, that lawyer would be disbarred, and properly so. That is irrefutable. That happened, regardless of when and where and with who. We also heard in that conversation that Governor Walz agrees with me, Keith Ellison said, that this piddly stuff shouldn't prevent people from receiving their grant distributions and staying in business. So when you look at the chain of relationships here, you've got the taxpayer who provides the resources. You've got the state agencies who administer the grants and manage them. You've got the grant recipient, and then you've got the people who are actually receiving the services. Of those four, the focus of Keith Ellison, and apparently, according to him, Tim Walz as well, was the grant recipient. We got to keep them in business. We got to keep business going. And so that raises the question of, is the culture of this administration one that actually cares about ensuring that the taxpayers' money gets spent in the way the legislature intended? Or is the focus on ensuring that people stay in business in order to benefit themselves? I'll turn it over to Jim Nash.
Well, good morning. I'm Representative Jim Nash from 48A. I am not a member of the committee, but I am the chair on the Republican side of State Government Finance. And as you've heard a number of times from us, really since before we started session, focusing on waste, fraud, and abuse was going to be something that all committees were going to be doing. State Government Finance is one in particular. And if you'll remember, we had a press conference where I detailed my House File 3 that we sort of called fraud notes. And I wanted to let you know, if you haven't read every word of the State Government Finance bill, and I'm sure you all have, that it is in the bill in totality. So that is completely in the bill. There will be 4 full-time OLAs once that bill gets signed into law. And there will be some other fraud package pieces from Representative Davis that are in there. There will be a lot of focus on, in that particular bill, on doing the waste, fraud, and abuse. And to pick up on what Representative Hudson just said, that self-attestation that he mentioned, that's part of what House File 3 will also be driving, is a proactive approach from the OLA to go in and say, based on the recommendations that we have made over time, have you actually implemented these best practices into your day-to-day operations? So now, rather than just wait and have a bureaucracy say, yep, we did that, check the box, the OLA is going to be actually going forward and making sure that that's done. And I will admit that I came to this a little bit late. I left the floor, so I wanted to make sure that I had some notes with me, and this is the very simple note. It's right here. It says, fraud equals bad. And that's what I think that all of us have been focusing on from the very beginning of this session. Fraud is bad. And as you heard Chair Robbins say from the very beginning, this is not just fraud that doesn't impact anybody. It impacts people who, in good faith, pay their taxes to the state of Minnesota, expecting that something good will come out of them. And what we have seen is something entirely to the contrary. So from my presentation, if you take away nothing other than fraud is bad, that's what we're focusing on. And the State Government Finance Bill has a lot of funding that will be going to combating waste, fraud, and abuse through the OLA. Everybody respects the OLA. She does a fantastic job, and that office always has done a fantastic job. That is how the State Government Finance Bill will land. I have every expectation that that provision will come into law. So thank you.
So thank you very much. We're happy to stand for questions about the committee or about our work over the interim, whatever questions you may have.
Madam Chair, it's the only committee that Republicans got to continue holding a majority on. Do you feel like it became partisan or that it still maintained the bipartisan process other committees had?
You know, we really tried hard to keep it bipartisan because I really do see it as a separation of powers issue. But clearly, we have a 5-3 majority, and our colleagues didn't always agree with some of the things that we said in committee. But I think there is truly effort across both caucuses to address fraud. And I do think I would say some of our colleagues on the other side were frustrated that we didn't dive more into specifics with investigators or the business model of fraud, but we invited many of those people, and they declined our invitation because they don't want to expose the tricks of the trade in a public hearing. So we had some private meetings with prosecutors and others to kind of learn more about it from the behind-the-scenes role, but I think even in the Attorney General's hearing, his lead said she also didn't want to get too specific because they don't want to tip off the people they're investigating or give any, hints about what they look for. So, but I do think we saw a number of things about the business model of fraud. We're really helping agencies understand how they need to better manage, like when they see anomalies, when they see huge increases in licensure. One of the big things we found was that a lot of the fraud is taking place in areas where Medicaid has been expanded in Minnesota in recent years because those are unlicensed services. So think autism centers, peer recovery, addiction centers, sober homes. All of those areas are a huge area of fraud, and I think that was a big lesson learned from the committee that we are going to be diving into much more over the interim, and that I think the finance and policy committees will also be looking at in terms of bringing some regulation to those spaces.
As far as the first year of this committee goes, how do you guys feel reflecting on, sort of what you guys were able to accomplish and whether the work that could have been done on this committee could have been enveloped into other committees like it was in years past?
I don't think it could be well done in other committees. Not that they don't try and they don't have hearings, and all the committees are doing great work in their lane, but to have an enterprise-wide view of it is very different, and the policy committees and the budget committees don't have time. So creating the fraud committee for the institution of the legislature is really important because it gives a place for us to continue to have these broad oversight conversations. One of the issues that actually came out yesterday when we were meeting with the AG's head of the fraud control unit for Medicaid is that they also are frustrated by the lack of data and the lack of ability to look across agencies. So that's one thing I know Chair Nash is working on some technology upgrades for the state. But having that enterprise-wide lens is the mission of our committee, and I think that will help prevent some of the problems that have crept up because of siloing.
Can you talk about the legislatively named grants? It sounds like, bipartisan support to rid of them, but there's nothing in any bill that would say this can no longer be a practice of the legislature. Is that correct? And do you anticipate something like that maybe next session, banning legislatively named grants and requiring all RFPs for such money?
Right. I don't know that we can actually ban them, right? So every member has an election certificate. They can drop any bill they want. So I don't know that we technically can ban them, but what we need to do is change the culture. And I think we're having remarkable success on that already. The number of earmarks that are coming out of committees right now is way down. And people even talk about it on the floor. Well, this bill has no earmarks. Like it's become, rather than being proud of all the earmarks, we're now proud that we've limited them. But I do have plans for next session to work on some forward-looking area on policy where if we are going to have legislative named grants, that they go through a front-end risk analysis and maybe some sort of a process where it goes to a certain subcommittee or something, and we at least look at the 990, we verify they have the capacity to do it, we have risk analysis and the fraud note done. So, because we can't probably take away legislators' ability to do it, and to be fair, some of the grantees want to be legislatively named still because they don't trust the agency process. And they said, well, we would never get through the agency when it's, of a particular persuasion. And we want everyone to have a fair playing field for having access to doing the work for taxpayers, but we want to know the work is getting done and we want to know the money is spent wisely. And so I think there are ways we can work on that, but really limiting legislatively named grants will go a long way.
Is there a reason it wasn't this session, but you couldn't do those things you just mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in conversations with people about it, but again, we spent the whole first section of session having hearings and learning. And by the time we got our fraud committee bills dropped, it was deadline week. And so we just kind of ran out of runway because to just remind everyone, Democrats missed the first 23 days of session, so we weren't having committee. And then when they did come back, our committee only meets once a week, and it meets on Monday mornings. And there were 3 Mondays that were holidays. So we have really had limited ability to meet and get through the huge amount of work we have. So that's why we're going to continue to meet over the interim.
Forgive me if this was asked before I came in. The Office of Inspector General, the House and Senate, I know have different versions. Just can you update folks on where that stands?
Yes, Representative Anderson's been our lead on that, so I'll let her speak to that.
Yeah, thank you. So the, where they stand right now is that the OIG in the Senate, I think, is going through finance today and will be on the floor, I think, tomorrow. So that's the latest thing I've heard. That bill has the Inspector General in the executive branch. Essentially, there will be, the way that it is now, there will be a panel of legislators from both parties, like the Legislative Audit Commission, and actually, I think it should be the Legislative Audit Commission, so you might see that, but nonpartisan, that will make recommendations to the governor. They'll make 3 recommendations. The governor can choose from those or choose his own, but it needs a 2/3 confirmation in the Senate. So it is what we have tried to do, the very, very hard is to keep this office, whether it's in the legislative branch or the executive branch, completely independent of the administration. Because they have to be able, and independent of the legislature, frankly. They have to be non-political. They have to be able to do their job. And that's what has been the problem. We have had inspector generals within agencies that are political, that are appointed by the commissioners, that answer to the commissioners, that have been stopped in doing their job by the commissioners and by the governor's office. I know this, okay, because we've talked to former OIGs regularly. And so that's what we're trying to avoid. Now, the House bill is sitting in State Gov, where I say it's been held hostage for a month by someone on the other side who's actually working on the bill. But the bill is in under the legislative branch. The difference is, and this is what it's going to come down to, is that if it is in the legislative branch, it cannot have law enforcement power or police power. That's the difference, and that's a separation of powers thing. And when this bill started back in January, I think that was unknown about these things. So it's been this long process, and we're going to have to make a decision, assuming that the bill comes out of the Senate tomorrow in a form that's somewhat palatable, most of which we've been negotiating weekly together as a team. But assuming it comes out in a form that's worth giving it a shot to pass something through the House, then we will caucus that here and make a decision and go forward. So that's exactly what it is. Does that make?
So will
Yep.
this probably not be part of a global? Would you see this issue of waste, fraud, abuse breaking off from a global deal and running separately?
There's no reason that this OIG needs to be part of a global deal. Both parties support this. The governor in a state of the state said he would sign the bill if it got through. So this is not, this has evolved into a bipartisan working group where we've essentially been doing conference committees for months over at the Senate every Tuesday night. That's how this is, it's been working backwards because the state, the bill in the House is different and it's been being held up until there's an agreement.
Do you think this actually might happen then?
Yes, I believe it will happen. But I will know for sure when I see how the bill comes out of the Senate tomorrow.
I want to go back to earmarks if I can, because
Thank you.
OLA has recommended since 2007 that you eliminate those. And I know you mentioned that that's probably something you can't do, but I wonder, you mentioned fewer earmarks this session, but you also had a smaller budget to work with. And I can foresee another session where there's a big surplus again and suddenly everybody wants earmarks. So I'm wondering if there are boundaries that you can see yourselves putting around these legislatively named grants.
In this session, I don't think, we've run out of runway, but next session, absolutely. We will have some sort of a policy bill where any legislative earmarks have to go through a process that includes risk assessment, that includes analyzing 990 and capacity, and that is bipartisan. So that members can certainly recommend things like they do sort of to the Legacy Committee, but there will be oversight before legislatively named grants can actually be named. And that's really important because as the OLA has said in numerous reports, what happens when there's a legislatively named grant right now is because the agency has to spend the money and give it directly to that earmark, they don't do all the oversight because they have so many other things to do. So it just, there's less oversight on the legislatively named grants, which is where we've seen more of the fraud. Not necessarily because there's fraud in, there's fraud in a wide swath of places, but certainly that's contributed to fraud that the agencies have not done the oversight because they had to spend the money.
Are there any fraud bills in public safety today? They're going to conference committee. I know some of it is obviously in state and local government. I'm just curious.
Yes, we've been kind of tracking all the different fraud provisions in different bills, and let me see if there's something in public safety. Yes, so there's been an effort with the Department of Veterans Affairs that they're going to start using Maxis to check whether participants are eligible. And this eligibility issue is across every agency. And we had invited DHS in yesterday to talk about eligibility because that's been a huge problem in many programs. And unfortunately, because of negotiations, they weren't able to send the person they had sent, but we plan to have an interim hearing on that. So figuring out eligibility and ensuring people are eligible before you make the payment, a lot of this is about getting ahead of it, recognizing it before the money goes out the door, because just chasing money once it's out there is a losing proposition. We need to stop it on the front end, and there's a lot of tools we can do.
Can Representative Nash answer the question? There was some talk a little bit about conflicts of interest more within the scope of agencies, but there has been a discussion about the legislature and conflicts of interest this year, namely over in the Senate with Senator Bobby Joe Champion. There was a code of ethics for state legislators in your bill, I believe, before it was taken out. Why was it taken out? And can you talk about, is there an appetite to do something on expanding conflict of interest rules for lawmakers? Because you guys, it's pretty narrow.
I'd say that some of us are very interested in putting in conflict of interests. I think that if you watched the Senate yesterday, their own ethics hearing, that was a topic of conversation there. I think that it would be wise to put something like that into law. All of us stand for election, and a good legislator is more than happy to fling the doors wide open and let people take a look as to what's going on in that confluence of your personal life and your legislative life. However, I don't get to dictate everything that's in the bill, so that's sort of where the wheels on that bus fell off.
So is that to say that the Democrats don't want it, or that you want to have more time in the interim to talk about the scope of that code of ethics?
I'll let you use your words as to who doesn't want them, but that was not something that wound up going into the bill because there was not mutual agreement between Chair Cleaver and myself.
Regarding the legislatively named grants, it doesn't appear the Senate has adopted the same practice as some of the committees in the House. So do you expect in conference the House members to acquiesce to the Senate regarding the legislatively named grants, or do you expect them to hold their ground regarding not including them in a conference committee report?
We absolutely expect the House to hold their ground. This has been a top priority for House Republicans and for Democrats. As you saw, both letters were bipartisan. So we want to effectuate culture change, and holding your ground on legislatively named grants is a key part of that.
Is this something you would foresee a DFL majority maintaining the work on this committee?
I hope so, and that's why we've tried very hard to be bipartisan where we can, because to me, we want this committee to outlive this session. It's very important to the institution of the legislature to provide oversight of the executive branch. So my hope is that regardless of who's in charge, regardless of who's governor, there will always be a fraud committee. And I've encouraged our counterparts in the Senate to create a fraud committee, because I think it should be in both bodies.
Is the sense with the members that you shared the committee with on the other side of the aisle that they would like to continue that work?
I've honestly not had that conversation with them. Clearly, they didn't want to create the fraud committee, but I think now that we've had our first session under our belt and it's gone well and we've actually identified real things that need to be changed, I'm hopeful that they will now see the value of it and that it will continue.
Did you guys probably one more experience any setbacks not having the subpoena power that you wanted?
I don't think so this session. So we did talk about it a couple times, and I think for laying the groundwork, it wasn't necessary this session. There may be times when it's necessary, and my hope is that we would get bipartisan support if we came across a case where we felt it was necessary. But so I meet regularly with very significant whistleblowers. And what's been the disposition of those cases is that I tell them, please go to the FBI, please go to the U.S. Attorney. So we have handed off very significant allegations of fraud that we've uncovered throughout this session that, have been behind the scenes to law enforcement. And then once law enforcement takes it over, we don't know what's going on with the investigation. But so in that sense, we haven't needed the subpoena power because our committee doesn't have law enforcement authority in any sense. We're an oversight committee. So our best use when there's something that rises to that level is to turn it over to law enforcement, which we have done on a number of occasions.
Thank you.
Thank you.